How is it possible that one of the most successful pilots in the history of Formula One cannot even enter the Q3 with Ferrari in their house circuit? The most disconcerting was that there was no obvious mistake, no dismissal that could be pointed out as a unique cause. There were no trompos, there were no track or strange strategies. There was simply no rhythm. It was as if SF-25 had torn off the soul at the most important moment. GPS data showed nothing alarming at first sight, but reality on the track told another story. The car did not react well in the strong braking areas, it did not find sufficient traction in the slow curves, and what is worse, did not transmit confidence to the pilots. For Hamilton, this was a devastating blow. Not only because of the result, but for what it represents symbolically. His debut on Italian soil as a Ferrari pilot, far from being a celebration, became a demonstration of helplessness. His subsequent statements were revealing. He spoke of frustration, of feeling completely shattered. It was one of those moments in which the figure of a seven-time champion is humanized, breaks in front of the microphones not because of his mistake, but because his machine did not live up to it. And in Formula One, when the machine fails, everything else falls apart with it. Amid the disappointment, the contrast with other teams was even more cruel. While McLaren celebrated a brilliant pole with Oscar Piastri, demonstrating a solid and ambitious evolution, Ferrari offered an image of stagnation. In that same scenario loaded with history, the present of Cavallino seemed caught in a frustration loop. What should be a step towards redemption ended up confirming that at this point of the season, Ferrari is far from his aspirations. What happened with the SF-25 in Imola was not simply a specific performance fall. It was the clearest demonstration of a latent technical crisis. From the pre-season, Ferrari has been working on a platform that, at least in theory, had to overcome the deficiencies of the SF-24. The new car was designed with a more aggressive approach in aerodynamic terms, with a philosophy that sought to balance the load in high-speed curves with a better traction in slow areas. However, the theory is not translating into results consisting of the track, and the classification in Imola was a painful test of it. In addition, the team's decisions in terms of pre-classification configuration were also part of the problem. Ferrari opted for a more conservative tuning, looking for stability in high speed of the circuit. But that decision was penalized in the sections where agility and precision were required, as in the high variant and the Ravazza. The car's response in those curves was so poor that both Leclerc and Hamilton reported chronic subwiring and waste of time in each lap launched. It is no accident that neither pilots managed to improve significantly in their last attempt. This points to a deeper problem. Ferrari is caught between two development philosophies. On the one hand, they try to maintain a safe base that allows consistent results. On the other, they need to risk if they want to compete from you with McLaren and Mercedes, who have been much bolder in their evolutions. But that midpoint in which Ferrari is now generating a car or stable enough to exploit its rhythm in classification or flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions in other words, SF-25 is not a bad car, but it is deeply limited. And the most frustrating thing is that its defects are not immediately solved. It is not just about changing a spoiler or adjusting the chassis rake. The architecture of the car is restricting the configuration options. That forces pilots to lead to the limit of a very precarious balance, where any imbalance in tire pressure, in fuel loading, or even at room temperature can translate into a loss of half a second by return, an eternity in classification. Since the beginning of the 2025 season, one of the most discussed aspects within the Ferrari garage has been the SF-25 brake system. It is not an intermittent failure or a minor characteristic. We talk about a chronic problem that has conditioned the performance of the car from the first laps of the preseason tests in Bahrain, and that in Imola reached a critical point. This defect, far from being merely technical, has deep implications on the confidence of the pilot, the consistency of the fast return, and, above all, the ability to extract the maximum of the car in classification. During the weekend in Imola, both Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc clearly vocalized their frustration. The radio witnessed his helplessness. Hamilton summed it up in a heartbreaking phrase, "These damn brakes, friend," while Leclerc was even more direct by declaring that he is not stopping. This was not simply an emotional complaint. It was the finding that the braking system was behaving erratically, without consistent logic, as if each round were a dice run. Sometimes the car stopped as expected. Other times the brake bite point moved, generating imbalance and confusion. The most serious thing is that this is not a new failure. Ferrari had already detected during the tests that the design of the brake cooling system was not working optimally. Instead of maintaining a stable temperature, thermal oscillations were generated that altered the braking pressure unpredictably. This forces the pilots to make manual adjustments in the braking bias return after return, a task that is not only exhausting, but completely breaks the necessary rhythm to build a competitive return in classification. The problem with the SF-25 was exactly that. The pilots did not know how the car was going to answer every time they stepped on the pedal. They could not push to the limit because that limit became diffuse, changing, dangerous. For Hamilton, this situation is especially complicated. Its piloting style is based on slowing away, transferring weight to the front axle and rotating the car controlled with a high curve, high speed. When the brake system does not respond precisely, its style becomes ineffective. He is forced to modify his entry into curve, to release the accelerator before and, in many cases, to opt for more conservative trajectories. All this implies a direct loss of time per lap. And if this happens on a clue as technical and narrow as Imola, the punishment is immediate and brutal. The root of the problem does not seem to be in the hardware, that is, on the discs or brake tweezers, but in the integration of the system into the SF-25 chassis. Ferrari has tried to innovate with a more compact design to optimize aerodynamic flow around brake ducts, but that decision has compromised the ability of the system to remain within the ideal thermal range. In addition, temperature sensors do not always deliver coherent data, which has hindered the task of engineers to find a specific solution. This type of problem is not solved for a week for another. Requires redesign, simulator validation, and track tests. But the most worrying thing is that the persistence of this ruling is eroding the confidence of the pilots. Each session in which Hamilton or Leclerc must deal with an unstable braking is a lost session to find the car limit. It is time that it is not invested in refining strategies, in exploring new configurations, in really attacking the race weekends. F-25 not only needs speed, you need reliability in your sensations. And until Ferrari fails to offer a brake system that allows its pilots to stop aggressively in certainty, it will be running with an invisible but lethal disadvantage. Because in Formula One, the difference between a good turn and a mediocre return is not only in the horses of strength, but in the precision with which you can stop at 300 km per hour and trust, without a shadow of doubt, in which the car will answer you. The most disturbing of the SF-25 is not its low punctual performance, but the feeling that Ferrari is caught in a spiral of technical inertia. In other words, the car is not evolving to the rhythm that demands a season where each Grand Prix marks critical differences. While teams like McLaren and Mercedes have demonstrated the capacity to adapt, aerodynamic innovation and strategic response, Ferrari seems to walk in circles. Each attempt to update is felt as a temporary patch more than a background solution, and that generates silent but very deep wear within the structure of the equipment. From the first Grand Prix in Australia, it was clear that SF-25 does not have a broad margin of adaptability. In cold track conditions or with hard compounds, the car suffers to find adhesion. When it is subjected to higher thermal demands, as in Imola, its structural weaknesses in traction and braking areas are naked. This rigidity in its technical behavior has made the development department work in a very small window, limiting the type of updates that can be implemented without triggering other side effects. The most worrying thing, however, is that the improvements introduced from the China GP that included a new flat background design and an adjustment in the rear suspension have not had the desired impact. In fact, they have generated more uncertainty than certainties. Hamilton expressed after the classification in Imola that the car does not react as we expected after the changes, a statement that calls into question the coherence between the work of the wind tunnel and the reality on the track. And if Ferrari cannot trust the correlation of his data, any attempt at evolution becomes an act of faith rather than an evidence-based strategy. This lack of technical progress has begun to exert visible pressure on all levels of the equipment. Engineers seem divided between those who bet on a deep review of the concept of the car and those who consider that the current design can still be optimized. This internal tension is not new in Maranello, but dangerous when combined with the media expectation and the unwavering demand of the Italian fans. Each error, every bad classification becomes ammunition for criticism that shoots both from the press and from the team's own halls. In this context, Lewis Hamilton's role acquires an even more complex dimension. The British arrived in Ferrari not only as a pilot, but as a figure of leadership, someone capable of restructuring the competitive mentality of the team. But even he, with all his experience and analytical capacity, is running with a more rigid reality than he imagined. After the classification in Imola, his words not only reflected disappointment, but also a subtle alarm signal. I am doing everything I can. But we do not get the car to enter the right window, there are no miracles. In summary, SF-25 is a car that not only has mechanical limitations, drag and identity problem, It is not yet known if Ferrari is building on solid foundations or simply surviving with what he has. Imola's outcome was not simply a bad weekend, it was a turning point. For Lewis Hamilton, it was the confirmation that his challenge in Ferrari will be more complex, technical and emotional than any simulation could have anticipated. And for the Italian team, it was a symbolic blow. It is not enough to have the most laureate pilot in history if the car you deliver is not even close to living up to its talent. The question that now floats in the paddock is not whether Ferrari can gain races, but if he will be able to build, in real time, a project that does not disintegrate his new figure before he can even aspire to fight for something serious. The immediate path is uncomfortable. The calendar does not respond. With Monaco just around the corner and demanding circuits such as Barcelona and Canada on the horizon, Ferrari has no margin for errors. They need an effective update, a qualitative leap, not only in terms of stopwatch but in stability, predictability and trust for their pilots. And that, in modern Formula One, implies a surgical operation of settings that goes from simulation software to track execution. Hamilton can provide knowledge, experience and leadership, but if you don't have a competitive tool in your hands, your efforts will be swallowed by inertia. For Hamilton, the dilemma is also existential. He is not a pilot in search of redemption or revenge. He is someone who has already won everything and now seeks to leave a different legacy, to be the man who returned Ferrari to the top. But to achieve this, you need time, institutional support, and a team that is willing to listen to it, not just to celebrate it. He needs his technical comments not to be diluted among the internal bureaucracy. And above all, it needs every frustration like Imola to translate into a step forward, not in a repetition of past errors. What follows for Hamilton and Ferrari is not a clear line, but a series of blind curves. In some you will find the opportunity to redeem yourself. In others, the risk of getting further lost in mediocrity. Everything will depend on how they react now. Imola's disaster can be remembered as the lowest point, or as the moment they decided to take control of their destiny. But the truth is that, in Formula One, the story does not expect. And each unanswered race is one more page that is written against.